Hello.
Hello.
As you should all know by now, you've been listening to me wittering on all day. I'm Karen.
I'm Dennis.
And we have for you our next guest is the lovely Penny Griffiths Morgan. Come on, words like that. Penny Griffiths Morgan. I will bring her on screen now. Hello. Ta-da!
I bet you lost for words, don't I, Karen?
I don't know. That's 2 days in a row. You've made me jibber jabber because I have to get my words out. I think it's just you.
Me, I have that power.
All those meetings yesterday, and it was only when I spoke to you I couldn't get my words out.
You're starstruck, is that what it is?
That's what it is. I'm starstruck by you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Yes, I'm looking forward to talking and looking forward to this. I haven't done this presentation before. It's a new one, especially for you. So we'll have to see how it goes.
Okay. And would you like to tell everybody that hasn't read, even though I put the information on there, and anyone hasn't read it, do you want to tell everybody what your presentation is called?
Well, I've termed it Victorian illnesses, but probably not very writer-esque. Yucky Victorian illnesses. I am going to say this. If anyone is of a nervous disposition or has got young children who might see some of these slides, I'm not joking, they might want to be careful, because even though I've not put up the goriest, some of them, even my 11-year-old son went, ooh, when he saw it. So, yeah.
Yeah. I saw a couple you showed me yesterday, and that was enough for me. No thanks. I was like, oh, I'm so glad. And what did I say to you? I'm so glad I put you on in the afternoon, Penny. I wouldn't want to be eating my lunch.
Yeah, I was careful, though. I mean, honestly, some of the ones I was finding that I could use for some of these illnesses, yeah, I could have got a lot worse. But I thought, nah, let's not detract too much from what I'm trying to say with the images. But yes, in all seriousness, I would say there is a bit of a content warning on this. But my goal with this presentation, as it is with all the history stuff I do, isn't to try and sort of shove history down people's throats. It's to give people something they can use when they go out investigating. So, you know, you'll when I talk about some of them, you can use some of the terminology that I'm giving you and some of the names and some of the shall we say, nicknames for the illnesses, and possibly use them when you're out investigating and fit them into the right era, but all will be revealed.
So, shall we
so far, Dennis?
What's that, sorry?
Have you understood so far? Hey, achievement!
Okay, there's a bit of an inside joke about Penny and Dennis not understanding each other. So just for anybody else out there thinking, are they being serious? No, they're not.
Yeah. And I will say, I am locked in my bedroom, but if anyone suddenly sees my arm shoot out like that, it's because one of the kids has decided to come in and I'm slamming the door on them. I would think it's some like weird reaction to something. It'll be to stop one of my children suddenly walking in.
That sounds really...
As Karen knows, it's definite occupational hazard when I'm trying to do presentations that one of my kids will suddenly decide to pop behind me.
I got to meet one last night, and we got lots of faces and all sorts of things. But it's rather entertaining. I like the mask and everything that he brought on screen too. He was proper in the zone last night.
Oh, don't! He actually went up and scared his little brother with it. When Lies was off camera, he's in floods of tears because his dad had up and scared his little brother, who genuinely burst into tears and got told off for it. So, it's always fun and games in the Morgan household, I can tell you. But so today's presentation is going to be on Victorian illnesses. We're going to take it so that it's just going to be my slides, so that you don't have to see sort of me sort of looking a bit, what's the next slide? And you don't going off on camera, and then come back and answer any questions. So I'm sure Karen and Dennis will do a great job with noting down any questions that
we will do. I will.
But But there's loads of people and names I recognise already in the
Well, that's good.
room. So
Well, Dennis is there. He's got the pad. The pens here are all
brilliant. So hi
we
everyone.
can go back. We can go back through the comments anyway, and just check any questions anyone's got. And if you're ready with your presentation, we'll go with your presentation, and then we'll do all our Q&As afterwards, if that's okay with you.
Yeah. Okay.
Just in case the audience have the same questions as us.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to go into the first slide now, if that's all right. If you can do the bring the
of course. I am. See you all soon.
There we go. Right, I will just bring up the slides. Okay, so hopefully everyone can still hear me and can still see the slides, although you can't see my freshly washed and made up face. That is another standing joke between me and Karen, because the poor girl had to talk to me last night when I had no camera on and I hadn't had to wash my hair that day. So yeah, lucky. I actually showered and got changed today. I got out of my tracksuit. Anyway, so today's talk, I wanted to talk about something else to do with the Victorian era. As a lot of you know, one of my, I suppose, specialisms, for want of a better word, is the poor laws, the workhouse movement. And it is a bit of a standing joke that someone mentions workhouses and I'm going to jump in there with facts and figures and things and sort of almost defending what they were there for. But there was also obviously a lot of illness in the Victorian era, although it's not, it's not unique to the Victorian era, but there were certain ones that started to make an appearance. And I want to talk about some of these and give you some of the information about them that you might be able to go away and use, like I said, on when you're doing investigations, because historical information and historical facts are amazing triggers to use, because it means something. If the spirit is from that era and they understand the terminology you're using, it will mean something to them. So do feel free to note down any questions you may have and then ask me at the end. There will be time for me to answer any questions. And I always say, if I don't know the answer, I will find out for you. So, illness. Well, this is one of the nicer images, by the way. Many of the conditions I'm going to talk about are not reserved solely for the poor. I mean, let's face it, illness doesn't really discriminate. If you're going to come down with it, you're going to come down with it. But a lot of the living conditions and working environments for the poor in the Victorian England, then into the first half of the 20th century, were rife for illness to spread and for a lack of medical care, especially pre sort of late 1940s in the NHS. They did spread basically like wildfire. And when you've got to think that it was only from, say, 1834 in the Poor Law Amendment Act that workhouses started to get the infirmaries, which was the only place that the poor, i.e. if you couldn't afford to pay for medical care, were able to get any. And yet these infirmaries weren't hospitals as we would know them now. Most had access to a medical officer, a doctor, but a lot of these doctors weren't there exclusively. They would go there, say, 2 or 3 times a week, check on everything, tell the staff what to do, and then leave. And the other thing to bear in mind is that the staff weren't nurses for a very long time. A lot of them were paupers who wanted extra rations, and so would treat these people under ostensibly what the doctor had told them to do. But a lot of the time, there's many stories of this, the paupers were just drunks who got extra beer or whatever, rations, and that's what incentivized them to do it. So the conditions weren't great, even in medical care. Well, one of the first things I'm going to talk about is not really an illness. It's a workplace, I suppose a workplace hazard. And this is to do with the matchstick girls. Now, you may not have heard of the matchstick girls, but there were so many things that I could have chosen from, and I wanted to choose 3 to keep this to sort of the 30 minute mark and not bore everyone to tears. Although I can't hear any snoring yet, so that's probably a good sign. But there's all these things like smallpox, diphtheria, whooping cough, or pertussis, as it was sometimes known, scarlet fever, typhoid, typhus, not the same illness. They are completely different illnesses. And these were all killers. didn't necessarily kill everyone, but they could, and especially children under the age of 5. I'm not going to give you the statistics for mortality of children under the age of 5, but in the more slum-based areas of Britain, sort of some of the slums in Manchester, Angel Meadows, you've got the slums in London, all those kind of places, the mortality rate of children under the age of 5 from things like whooping cough, diphtheria, all those kind of things was absolutely horrific. But what I actually want to look at is the matchstick girls. And this was a workplace, I guess, affliction that could happen to them that scarily the employers were aware of, but chose to ignore for the sake of profits. And you may or may not have heard of it. Back in the early part of the 19th century, matchsticks were handmade. And many of those involved in the early stages and the various stages of manufacture were women from the East End of London, where the site of the Bryant and May, not the current Bryant and May, it was at one preceding that, was sited in Bow in East London. Now, when you look at the demographics of the area, many of these women were either first generation Irish immigrants or sort of second or third generation descended from the Irish, and that was what the area was predominantly made up of when we look at the demographics of the slums and everything else. These women would work, and they invariably were women, 10 to 12 hours a day, depending on the time of year. So in the winter hours, they would work less. In the summer, they would work more, and they would be standing the entire time. They would only be allowed to leave their station sporadically to go to the toilet. They would be expected to take their breaks at their station. They would be expected to eat whatever lunch they'd brought in with them at the station. There was no health and safety. There was no, I suppose you could say, sterile area for them to go to. Now, it had been discovered a few years earlier that by adding something called yellow phosphorus to the matchstick heads, it's also sometimes called white phosphorus, it made them much easier to light. So whereas before they had to be drier than dry for them to light, well, this allowed them to be lit pretty much anywhere, anytime. And, you know, the use of matches was so necessary in those times, whether it was to light lamps, whether it was to light pipes, whether it was to light cigarettes, whatever it was, that the business went into overdrive producing these light anywhere magic matches without really taking any consideration of the consequence. Now, the photo that you've been probably looking at of the girl who looks like she's got a swollen face at the side, she was a young girl from New York, and she was one of the ones who it was discovered that yellow phosphorus or white phosphorus was actually toxic. And it caused something called phosphorus necrosis of the jaw. Honestly, that is not easy to say. If you know, I have to slow down when I say it, and it's not something you ever want to try and say if you've had a couple of glasses of wine. Trust me. Now, the problem with this stuff is that as they were using it, the material, and it wasn't just one of the things I got to ask once if it was true, is did they lick the match heads to make it stick? It wasn't so much that, but the vapors of this phosphorus was in the air and it was landing on everything. So they would be inhaling it constantly. Now, remember, I said they were supposed to take their breaks at the workstation. So they would eat their meals there. So that meant that this poisonous dust was actually landing on their food and they were ingesting it that way. Now, the first clue to a person having what is known as fuzzy jaw was toothache. And this toothache was did develop into these horrendously painful abscesses that would just, and this is a disgusting bit, ooze pus. I mean, they didn't just look like a large spot. Apparently they oozed. And although the manufacturers of these matches were told as early as 1858 about this issue, they chose to ignore it. And the only action that they took, and this was worldwide, was if you had toothache and you didn't report it and have those teeth removed, you would be sacked, because that toothache could lead to what was known as fuzzy jaw. Now, this poor girl, the one I mentioned from New York, she was only 16 and she'd been working in the factories for a good few years, and she developed the toothache, developed the abscess. and had to go and get part of her jaw removed, as you can see in this picture. So that isn't a normal jaw. That jaw has been sawn away. Now, not just sawn away, she had no anaesthetic. There was no anaesthetic. She had basically maxillofacial surgery with a saw with no anaesthetic and went back to work shortly afterwards. I mean, it boggles the mind. But what was really sad about this poor girl is a few weeks later, she developed an abscess in the other side of her jaw and had to have that removed as well. Did this stop the manufacturers? Nope. Another picture of someone who's had part of is a man this time, had had part of his jaw removed. And some of the pictures I could have put up literally show people with gaping holes in the side of their face. And this could kill because it could spread to the brain. It could cause blood infections, septicemia and such. So not only was it, affected their faces, affected their looks, affected their ability to eat, it could kill. Now, it wasn't until somebody amazing called Annie Besant organised the Match Girl strike in 1888 that the spotlight was really placed on how destructive this ingredient was. But that's a talk for a whole new day, the matchstick girls. In 1891, William Booth, yes, the founder of the Salvation Army, started making matches with red phosphorus that wasn't as toxic. It was much, much safer, and he tried putting pressure on the larger manufacturers to follow suit. Now, white or yellow phosphorus, whatever you want to call it, was actually ultimately prohibited at the Berne Convention in 1906. But scarily, it wasn't outlawed completely in Europe until 1910. I find that absolutely horrific, that they knew how dangerous this ingredient was. They knew how many people it was damaging. But was it because the people it was afflicting were the poor that they didn't care? It does make me wonder if it had been afflicting the middle classes who were using the matches, maybe they would have done something about it. Who knows? But that's a quick talk about fuzzy jaw, phosphorus necrosis of the jaw. Not very nice, really, is it? Well, the next one, my second condition that I'm going to talk about is another really pleasant one. I am sure you have all heard of cholera. Unfortunately, it's still here. Not so much, not in the UK, but anywhere where there are slum areas with poor sanitation and everything else, it can be rife. But there was some very, very big outbreaks of it during the Victorian era in the slum areas of Britain. Now, but did you know how it was spread? Did you know that its mere presence in an area actually caused riots? And did you know about the water pump in London? No? Well, watch this space. So, the causes of cholera. Now, as I say, cholera as a disease has been around pretty much since man began. And sadly, until the world has decent sanitation and no slums and everything else, it will always be around. But the initial real records on how easily it could spread started in the early 1800s in India. Now, it first hit the UK badly in sort of 1831 into the early part of 1832 with something called Asiatic, I think that's how you'd pronounce it, cholera, taking its first victim in Sunderland, up there in the northeast, on the 20th of October, 1831. Now, the spread was slow to start, as with a lot of epidemics, as we know, but by the 9th of January 1832 it had claimed 215 lives alone in Sunderland, so not UK wide, just in Sunderland, and it had started to spread throughout the country. Now, most of those areas with the highest number of cholera deaths were the poor parts, because there was a lack of sanitation, a lack of clean water, and the middle class Victorians classed it as sloppy living. So they kind of felt they deserved it. You know, the whole sort of, and anyone who's seen me do my workhouse presentation will know that I say that the Victorians felt that the poor were poor because God willed it. It was God's wish that they were poor. You think of the hymn, the rich man at his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly. He ordered their estate. So it was kind of preordained that people would be poor, and therefore people would be poor, would drink too much, they wouldn't keep clean, they'd live in overcrowded houses, etc., etc. Nobody really thinking, was that the cause or was that the effect? It was too simple, I suppose, to assume that it was decreed that way. Now, they also believed that things like cholera were miasma related. And you've probably heard that term before when we talked about, say, the plague in the 1600s, miasma being it was a smell thing. Because you go into these slum areas and they would stink. They would smell. And the reason being is there was too many people living in too smaller spaces. There was no clearing of waste products. They would have sort of slurry pits in the slum areas that someone was supposed to, and this is not a job I'd want to do, was supposed to come and clear out. But these were slums, these were poor areas, so quite frequently they got left. And of course that stuff is going to seep into the water table, which is going to affect everything, and disease is going to spread. Now, whether it, the fact that they believed it was bad smells in the air didn't really help. They didn't make it a link to it being contaminated water at outset. That's not to say, however, that cholera guaranteed death. It didn't. People did survive from it. However, and again, I'm going to be a bit gory now, if you were exposed to Vibrio cholerae, it wouldn't be a pleasant death. Now, what they didn't realise at the time was the people who had diarrhoea, and I do apologise if this is offending anyone, but hey-ho, the diarrhoea would be very watery with what looked like little pieces of rice in it. What they didn't realise were these little rice-looking things in this watery diarrhoea was actually Vibrio cholerae, and that would actually get in to the water source. Now, this bacteria, again, this is pretty gross. It can last for around 5 hours once it comes out of the human body. And you think of the lack of sort of sanitary conditions in these slums. People would be, touching contaminated things and then not maybe, washing their hands properly. It would be getting on people's clothes. It would be getting into the water source, like the Thames. A lot of these places, there's a river nearby. The slums tended to be in the low-lying areas as well that would flood easily, therefore near to a water source. So it was getting into the water and it was passing around that way. So they would start with diarrhea. They would be in indescribable pain. They would be vomiting, and this would ultimately cause chronic dehydration, and it would kill them. So not only did it spread easily, because they thought it was the smell that was spreading it, nobody really understood about sort of infection control and all those kind of things. Take London, for example. It stank in the 1800s. The amount and variety of waste that was lobbed into the Thames gave off a stench that was potentially unparalleled. I mean, you read about something called the Great Stink in London. And this was when, and this is true, it's not myth, the Houses of Parliament, obviously being on the Thames, they were actually pegging their noses. And even though it was the summer and they wanted the windows open, they were having to shut them. They painted it with lime chloride to try and ward off the smell. Not necessarily putting two and two together and realizing it was a lack of decent sanitation that was causing this stench. And they truly believed it was the smell that was causing the cholera. In other parts of the UK, and this is really interesting, in other parts of the UK, people were suspicious when friends and family were taken to cholera hospitals. There were hospitals and centres, if you like, specifically for the illness to try and contain it, to try and stop it spreading. But as I say, people were suspicious because not many people came out of them. Obviously, they didn't have the drugs that we have now. They didn't have the knowledge of infection that we have now. And in Toxteth, in Liverpool, people started attacking the doctors and nurses who were working at these cholera hospitals and accusing them of something called burking. that is, deliberately murdering those who'd gone into the cholera hospitals, who could have survived as far as they were concerned, and then using their bodies for medical dissection. As we know, people were grave robbing and everything. And the term Birking did actually come from the infamous Burke and Hare case from 1828 that was just around 4 years beforehand. And for those of you who don't know who Burke and Hare was, go and look it up. They were very, very famous grave robbers in Edinburgh. But it was called Birking, that they thought that people were actually, the doctors were actually deliberately killing these people with cholera to use them for medical research. And Toxteth suffered riots at the Toxteth Cholera Hospital because of this. But there is always a voice of reason whenever something happens. And this was somebody by the name of John Snow, who decided to challenge this conventional theory of miasma and strongly suggested it was actually spread via the waterways. Now, there's a place in Soho it was called Broad Street. It's now called Broadwick Street. And Snow conducted a survey showing the majority of cholera victims in the third outbreak in London in 1854 came from the same water pump. And I know this map isn't great quality, but what you can see here, he's marked on the map where the different victims were, and you can see how closely bunched together they were. But sadly, people were still not taking him seriously. Now, he persuaded the authorities to move the handle to the pump, and ta-da, the case is reduced. Now, it transpired that one of the very early primitive sewage systems was actually leaking into the water supply, and that's how it was being spread. It was following this, and also London's last big outbreak in 1866, that Snow's original hypothesis was taken seriously, and more work was done to put in place better sewers and stop contaminated water being accessible. Although places like East London, where the poor were getting pushed out, and remember I told you about the Bryanton May factory in Bow, and the fact that, it was a poor part of London, took them a little while longer to catch up. However, if you go to Broad Street, right opposite the pub called the John Snow, which you can just see in the background, is the handleless pump. Now, nobody knows for sure if his actions did really stop the cholera outbreak, because it may just have been reaching the end of its cycle, because as with a lot of things, they go through a cycle of infection. But he was one of the first people to realise that cholera was not miasma related. It was something other than air, in this case, water. Now, I hope you're all still with me. You're doing really well. I can't see anyone, which is very strange when you're doing a presentation, but I seem to still be going, so it looks like Karen hasn't taken me off air yet. On to the last one, the White Plague. Now, this is an illness that is on the rise again, sadly. They used to inoculate people against it when you were 15. Normally you got it, but that's not been done for years because the UK thought they'd eradicated it. You may know it as, it's also known as the graveyard cough, consumption, or more stereotypically, tuberculosis, or TB. Now, it's caused by something called Mycobacterium tuberculosis, yet the Victorians, and you can see actually what the bacteria looks like up there, the pretty purple colour, although not so pretty if you're suffering from it. The Victorians actually romanticised this illness. The Victorian fashion was for very, very pale skin, was for slightly flushed cheeks, was for people to be ultra skinny, devoid of any muscle tone, and almost the appearance of being consumed from inside, which is basically what TB did to someone who had it in the lungs. You've got down there in a corner, you've got one of a TB type hospital with everyone in their beds with their big windows. But the picture I've put up there of the very sort of attractive pale young lady is a lady by the name of Marie Duplessis. Now, she was a French courtesan, quite a well-known one, but she died at the age of 23 from tuberculosis. And she is said to have been the inspiration for Verdi's La Traviata opera. Now, she epitomized what the fashionable look was, and she was being consumed by consumption, by tuberculosis at this time. It was also actually a disease that the wealthy didn't, weirdly enough, they didn't shy away from, because they didn't think it was just poor people who suffered from it. They didn't attribute it to poor living conditions, although it is spread by coughing and droplets and everything else. So people living in slum conditions in very close together would have been more liable to contract it. But they thought it would be, but those in the artistic field, the poets, the playwrights, the authors, it would actually increase their sensitivity. And it was quite romantic to be wasting away in front of people. Romantic, but let's not forget about the diarrhea, about the blood-stained coughing, and potentially, ultimately, death. That's very romantic. It caused the world to lose absolute greats like Eleanor Roosevelt ultimately died from tuberculosis. Chopin, the actress Vivien Leigh, the author, one of my favourite authors, George Orwell, Jane Austen, the poet John Keats, who actually just wanted to use one of the perceived treatments for TB, and he went to live in Rome in a sort of a house at the base of the Spanish Steps, thinking that the environment there and the weather there and everything would actually help him. The Bronte sisters and their brother all succumbed to TB. Now, this is when they started to build the big sanitariums to look after them, and various different treatments were meted out, although it wasn't until after the sort of mid 1900s that they discovered medications that actually worked. The first, and this is a brilliant story, and I love this story, the first TB sanatoria in the UK was actually opened in London after many, many years of campaigning by Sir Philip Rose, who was a solicitor and also the son of a former army surgeon. He's believed to have set up the Hospital for Consumption and Diseases of the Chest in 1841 when he was only 25. I mean, that's amazing, isn't it? 25. After a clerk in his law practice was turned away from hospitals who would give free medical care to those who couldn't afford to pay, after he was suspected of suffering with the disease, he could get no help. So this hospital is now better known, and this is amazing, as the Royal Brompton. And I'm sure those of you who are in England have heard of the Royal Brompton. It is the largest heart and lung medical centre in the UK. I wrote a blog this week about Group Captain Leonard Cheshire, amazing man. And if you haven't read the blog, I would urge you to do so, because I was very, very moved writing it. Now, he suffered with TB after he'd left the RAF. I think it was 1950 he was diagnosed. And they actually removed his lung and some of his ribs to try and help it. That's how harsh the treatment could be. Another former sanatorium that you probably heard of that was founded in 1916 at the Cambridgeshire tuberculosis colony, Papworth. It's another one you'll have heard of. Now, you can always tell these former TB hospitals by their large verandas, as sunshine and fresh air, regardless of the temperature outside, was seen as a treatment for this. As what, oddly enough, cod liver oil. I found an accounts report that in 1852, the Brompton had used 569 gallons of the stuff, costing £203. The total drugs bill for the hospital was £308. That's a lot of cod liver oil. Now, the bacterium that you can see in that picture was only actually isolated by a German bacteriologist, Robert Koch, in 1882. So it was relatively recent that people started to find out about it. But with, But with so many things, great inventions can come out of absolutely horrific situations. And it was TB that caused physician René Linat to come up with something, the stethoscope, what we now know as the stethoscope. Sadly, the very illness he was trying to help people with, help people to diagnose and understand further, was ultimately what they believe killed him. But between 1890 and 1914, somewhere in the region of 300 local isolation hospitals were built. Although the vaccine, and I'm not going to I'm not a doctor, so I don't know how to pronounce it. Bacille Calmette-Guerin, or BCG vaccine, was actually discovered in 1906. It wasn't actually used on humans, and this is the vaccine, not the treatment, until 1921. So, and it wasn't really until after World War II that vaccination became widely accepted. Streptomycin was discovered in 1943, although that wasn't used for quite a long time. And then another treatment, isoniazid, I think, was discovered in 1952. Now, when you think you want to link into sort of hauntings and everything else, Waverly Hills, somewhere that I think nearly every single paranormal investigator I've ever met from every country in the world would like to investigate. Well, that was a TB sanatorium. That was built originally it was opened in 1910. In fact, on the 26th of July, for anyone wanting to make a note, my birthday. Not that I was born in 1910, although I'd look blooming good if I was. But yes, 26th of July, 1910. And that was designed to take on board about 40 to 50 people in that area. And it was a self-sufficient unit. In 1914, they created a children's ward there, because not just for children with TB, but for the children of patients with TB who had nowhere else to go. But in 1924 to 26, it was actually extended and had over 400 patients. And that was just for one area. That was just for one district. It wasn't even for the whole state of Kentucky. It was just one actual little district. But gory photo warning alert. Does TB just affect the lungs? No. It can affect anywhere. There's lots of different ones, and if I mention some of the names, you probably would have heard. You can get TB of the brain, you can get TB of the spine, you can get TB of the adrenal glands. But one of the ones that actually I found quite interesting, because it seemed to be quasi-supernatural, is that of scrofula, or what it was sometimes known as the king's evil. Now, the reason it was known as this was until around the early 18th century, people actually believed that the touch of a king could cure you of this. It's a lymphatic infection, as you can see there with that poor young lad and the sort of the growths on the side of his neck. Charles II is reported to have touched over 100,000 subjects during his reign. And it was almost seen as a way of checking if a monarch was a legitimate leader, because if they couldn't cure it, then why were they the leader when the king's touch was meant to be able to help? The practice did die out in the UK in the 1700s, but it continued in France till the early 19th century. And I say, why was it seen as supernatural? Well, it was seen as a punishment for sins, because it is so obvious. So if you developed scrofula, king's evil, you had done something sinful and you were being punished from a supernatural basis. And it was also, for a very long time, people thought TB was hereditary. So it was a given. If your family suffered from it, you would inherit it. They didn't realize it was cross-infection, not hereditary. And although it's pretty much died out now, it's still there, especially for people who are immune compromised. Now, that has been about half an hour talking about Victorian illnesses. There are a lot more that I could talk about, treatments of different ones and everything else, but I don't want to, freak you all out completely. But what I would say is, when you're investigating somewhere, do use terms like graveyard cough, white plague, consumption. If you are investigating somewhere that was a slum, any spirits there who lived there when it was a slum, these things are going to mean something to them. If you ever get to investigate in Bow, where the matchstick factory was, and I think it's now converted flats, but you never know, you may be somewhere where people who worked in the matchstick factory lived. You can talk about this. You can talk about fuzzy jaw. You can talk about, the light anywhere matches, and use these terms and use them to aid your investigation, and just add that little extra bit to it. Well, that's me pretty much done. I do hope you've enjoyed this. Please don't forget to check out my books. In fact, Haunted Experiment, I found out this morning, has been nominated for an award with the Higgy Pop Awards, which I am chuffed to pieces about, it has to be said.
You're very welcome. I didn't nominate you.
Thank you. And yes, that's pretty much it. That's it.
So we are back. The three of us are back on screen, Penny.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting.
Good.
Not many people have actually asked any questions, but I think that's because they were so interested in what you were talking about. People so interested in what you're talking about, and there's been a lot of comments for you. I always enjoy listening to your presentations. Really, really interesting. Bloody love listening to that. Thank you. Very interesting. Yes, enjoying it. This is so interesting.
That one there says you're going to give me nightmares.
It does not.
I can actually see the comments, Dennis. Yes.
That's horrendous.
The Jon Snow pub. Yay.
Very educational, this one. Enjoying it. Great style, Penny.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for listening and putting up with me rambling about. I don't think
anybody thinks you've been rambling. You've got even more. Thank you. You've been so interesting. I've loved it. Love that. Thank you. Great talk. Very interesting talk. Learned a lot of things I had no idea about. Brilliant. Thank you. Totally forgot. So interesting. Oh, and Tracy's gutted because she just caught the tail end because she had a phone call, unfortunately.
Don't worry, you'll be able to catch it on your website and on YouTube, and you can watch the whole thing.
Yep, and it's being streamed to 5 Facebook pages, 2 websites. It's also on Just Paranormal as well as our website, and it's on YouTube. So yeah, it's in lots and lots and lots of places. They can see your lovely face everywhere.
I've seen Lorian's put a question.
Oh, have you? So we will put it on screen. So we know she's shy, so we'll put it on screen for you.
Yeah, shy and retiring is our Lorian. Yeah.
So have you ever made contact with a spirit that died of any of these illnesses?
Yes. I was at a recent one. I was at the Leopard Inn in Stoke earlier this year, and we heard someone coughing, and it wasn't one of us. And it was and somebody said, "Oh, do you think they had TB?" Nothing. And I said, "Did you have consumption?" And everything lit up. Ooh. So that was kind of what gave me the idea for doing this in the first place, is that using some of the terminology, it's like with whooping cough. A lot of people would know it. A lot of them would have known it as pertussis. I mean, that's what the technical name is. When you get the injection for it, they say pertussis. And I had to look it up when my kids were being inoculated against it. But it's using some of these different terminologies. And so if you hear someone coughing, you say TB, and they're like, if you turn around and say consumption or white plague, or, I mean, even I think back in the sort of 15 and 1600s, they called it the lung if someone had it. So, so you can use, but yes, I have had someone react when I asked them if it was consumption.
We had some more comments. Thanks, Penny. So interesting. Tracy's happy now. She put yay, which means she can watch it. Love this. Thanks. We don't need to ask questions as Penny explains all aspects so well already.
Oh, thanks, ladies. Thank you.
It's a good idea to use the terminology that was used at the time, and definitely something I'll use going forward.
Brilliant. Thank you. I really want with history that people don't think it's dull. They don't always think that it's not necessarily what you learned at school when you were just being taught dates and things like rote. It has got applications. It can be used. And I always say, you can watch your best horror film ever. I guarantee you can find something in history that's real that outdoes it. And, I didn't go into that much description about how people died from cholera and stuff, but I read.
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you. I'm glad.
The rice in the poo. I did read a description somebody wrote what it was like dying from it, and it sounds absolutely horrific. I mean, you know, that I did get asked when I told someone I was going to be doing this presentation. They said, "Are you going to mention typhus?" And I said, "What, typhus or typhoid?" And they went, "Same thing, isn't it?" No. And it was learning stuff like that as well. And yeah, I just think it's so useful to have these facts, or at least have someone who knows some of these facts for you to help you, to add that extra bit to an investigation, to give it a bit more credibility. I mean, even using it after, obviously, the event to check evidence and stuff, which is something I do a lot. But just using, say, the fact that I got a reaction when I said consumption, yeah, it's the same as TB, but they wouldn't have known the term.
Yeah. So we've got some comments. Thank you, Penny. We have a cholera cemetery on a mountain. I left it. Hold on, sorry. Oh, sorry. I'm looking at two things at once here.
Well, actually, one of the things, a book I read recently was on Angel Meadow slum that was in Manchester. A really good book. I recommend people getting it. And they talked about when they were trying to stop some of these epidemics, they would actually dissolve the bodies in lime to try and stop the infection, not thinking about the fact the slush from the dissolved stuff is going to get into the water table, therefore get to the river and infect it even more. So, yeah, it's there's an awful lot to it.
Another one. I'm totally with you. How can we investigate the paranormal without applying history? Spirits are historical after all. And Kelly says, where would you suggest is a good place to visit in London to do ghost tours?
The problem with London ghost tours is probably a bit different. I don't really do ghost tours in London. I go in somewhere and just immerse myself in the building. I know there's a couple of companies that do specific London-based ghost hunts. Fright Nights London is one of the ones that comes to mind. I know there's others, but I can't think off the top of my head. But the problem with a lot of the London venues is they're horrendously expensive to hire. You're looking at a minimum of sort of £1,000, possibly £2,000 to £3,000. One of my favourite ones that I have been to, though, in sort of what I'd call Greater London, is the Ragged School on Copperfield Road. And I actually talked about that in my first book, My Haunted History. That's a fascinating place. Just the fact it was a school set up it was known as a ragged school because kids would turn up with like tattered clothes, no shoes. They would actually, and these schools were set up very similar to things like the British schools, the national schools as well, which I talked about in a presentation that's on my YouTube channel.
Well, as you mentioned that, Penny, British School Museum, you wanted to, this is why I think of it, you wanted to mention that.
Well, I thought Dennis wanted to ask me a question on it, so I was leaving it to him.
No, it's fine. You've basically told us everything that we were going to ask you, so...
I haven't, because I haven't told you about my new book.
No, you need to tell us about your new book. He's just literally thrown his questions. So, can you tell us about before we go any further, can you please tell us about your new book, Penny?
Yes, I'm just finishing off a new book, which will be launched early next year, and it is on the British Schools Museum in Hitchin. For anyone who doesn't know it, the British schools were one of the schools that set up around the same time as the Ragged schools and the national schools, ostensibly to educate the poor, i.e. people who couldn't afford an education, because, a lot of these pioneers realised that if they taught these poor kids how to, I don't mean poor kids as in poor kids, but poor kids as in no money, how to read and write, it would get them out of that cycle of poverty. And this was set up by this movement was set up by a guy called Joseph Lancaster. And although there's other British schools around the UK, this is the only one that is a museum. And next year will be its 25th anniversary of being a museum. And the reason I got to investigate there with the Paranormal Sisters last year and was blown away by the place. And I've been back there a few times since. Always had something happen. And I know people say, well, it can't happen. You always had something happen, albeit sometimes small, but something has happened that I can't explain. And they asked me if I'd be interested in writing a book. And so I've written one that's obviously got some history of the area and why this school for the poor, for want of a better term, was actually built in that area. And then also some of the sort of people's haunted stories and experiences of things that have happened to them there. And that should be coming out early next year. And I'll be doing some sort of presentations, probably some virtual ones as well, depending on how the epidemic is going, and possibly appearing at the school to do a couple of special guest talks and investigations for them.
And all being well, COVID permitting, you will be joining us at 3 of our physical events next year.
Yep, I will.
So more talk. So Janice has got plenty of time to learn how to understand you in the next few months.
I can't believe you can't understand me. That is really sad.
I just think he loves winding you up. That's what it is. I'm sure
don't worry. I don't take it personally. I just
I know you don't. So I want to say thank you. I've literally just reiterated all the comments from everybody. John says, well done, Penny. Great one as always. Sounds great. Cool. Thanks. Fabulous. Thank you. Need to read that book. Really great watch this, Penny. So much research to do for such a presentation.
Thank you. I do enjoy it. And can I just say, if anyone wants to find out what I have got a website, hauntedhistories.co.uk. I've also got a YouTube channel, which I haven't put any new content on recently because I'm not really been able to get out and do any, but
unfortunately
look into that from the website. And also I've got a Facebook page and a Twitter page if people want to follow me on there. And I do post things on a regular.
We will get all of those links in the comments.
Yeah, and anyone who wants to post stuff on the Haunted Histories page, if it's to do with history or mystery, as long as it's not alive, it will normally get approved.
Don't forget your podcast as well.
Oh, yes. Thank you for that. Yes, I also have the Haunted Histories podcast. The one that's up at the moment, they all get stored. It's with Paranormal UK Radio. I do one every other Monday. The one that's up at the moment is with a guest you've got coming on, Richard Estep, talking about Gettysburg. And the one that will be loading in on Monday is with Mark Edgerton, talking about haunted Huntingdonshire.
Oh, interesting. So you've got lots coming up, even though we're in lockdown. So if you want to keep up to date with Penny, and like she said, her website, her podcast, all of her pages, then we will get our admin to put all of those in the comments for us so people know how to find you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Make sure you go into one of her talks at some point next year, hopefully. Not just for us, but obviously the British School Museum as well, because it's important to support these places, because if we don't, they will go under and they will close, and that'll be it, and we won't get access again.
Exactly. These are independent places. They don't have big companies behind them supporting them. They have to make their own money. And I think there's such a fundamental part. There's too much of our Victorian history that people don't like that's been wiped out. And, you know, I bust a gut to sort of stop that happening to anything else.
Well, thank you very much for today. Very much appreciate it. Thank you for everybody commenting. Thank you for everybody that's been watching. They've already been commenting about how fantastic you are. No questions or anything, because you're so intriguing and so interesting. Just in awe of you, obviously. That's what it is.
Oh, they all as well.
Stay with us. We won't say we'll say goodbye to you on here, but stay with us. Don't go anywhere. Don't log out. Thank you to everybody watching, and we will be back with you very shortly with Kieran O'Keefe.
Wonderful.